How does buying Fortnite skins and V-Bucks lead to one of potentially the most consequential court cases affecting big tech platforms ever? In this video, we'll get you up to speed on the entire Epic Games versus Apple saga, from the origins of the App Store under Steve Jobs to Epic's recent win that could have far-reaching effects in breaking the mobile app platform duopoly that Apple and Google have long controlled. At the heart of the case is whether the 30% fee that Apple and Google take on every purchase made in mobile apps is fair. Does Apple offer enough value to developers to justify taking 30 cents off every dollar? Do they enforce this policy fairly across all developers, or do some get preferential treatment? And is it monopolistic behavior to not only impose the fee, but to also prevent developers from offering alternative payment options outside the App Store? These are some of the questions that the Epic Games lawsuit against Apple seeks to answer. But to put it all into perspective, we should go back to the origins of the App Store and look at the conditions under which the 30% fee came to be.
So, you're a developer and you've just spent 2 weeks or maybe a little bit longer writing this amazing app, and what is your dream? Your dream is to get it in front of every iPhone user, and hopefully they love it and buy it, right? That's not possible today. Most developers don't have those kinds of resources. Even the big developers would have a hard time getting their app in front of every iPhone user. Well, we're going to solve that problem for every developer, big to small. And the way we're going to do it is what we call the App Store.
2008 was a pioneering time in the mobile app world. Apple had just launched the iPhone, and to their credit, they created the foundation for today's mobile app ecosystem. They did this by empowering and incentivizing the supply side of developers and apps, seeding the demand side of consumers, and then connecting the two by providing unparalleled distribution. So let's look at each element. Before 2008, building and selling software was a lot more expensive and risky, especially for small developers. Software needed to be spec'd for certain operating systems and platforms, and often you might need to work with a publisher to get your software distributed and marketed. And the idea of live operated or subscription-based apps was not yet so popular. The App Store flipped this system on its head by making it easy for developers to directly reach consumers, with Apple serving as a middleman. Apple didn't charge any credit card fees, hosting fees, or even marketing fees, and developers could set their own prices too. In fact, the developer could make their app completely free if they wanted to, and Apple would still happily eat the cost of distributing the app. In exchange, Apple took a 30% cut of all sales made through the platform.
This is the best deal going to distribute applications to mobile platforms.
At the time, this seemed like a great deal because sometimes other distributors could be taking up to 50%, for example. On the demand side, Apple simply made it easy and fun to be an app user. In fact, just the idea that you could wirelessly download an app directly to your device was a big innovation in and of itself. No longer did you have to connect your phone or your MP3 player to your computer and manually import files, and when a new update for the app was released, it would magically update on your phone over the air without you having to do anything. And all of this was connected to your Apple ID, so you could make payments, get refunds, download apps, manage your apps, all to your heart's content in a seamless, trusted platform. This leap in ease of use instantly exploded the total addressable market of app consumers that didn't exist before. And on top of it all, the iPhone provided distribution. With such a ubiquitous piece of hardware, developers could reach just about everyone with one storefront that was a discovery engine. It categorized, curated, and editorialized the app experience to surface new apps and games to millions of people. That niche game or meditation app or social app that previously either couldn't technically work or couldn't reach its audience now had a platform to solve these issues. Small developers can now build giant businesses. And in a way, Apple democratized apps for everyone. So with all that, is Apple taking 30% fair? I think the answer changes depending on what time period you're looking at and at what scale. If you would have asked me in 2008, I would say yes. Apple took on a lot of risk and investment in growing market share for iPhones, and they outcompeted their peers. But is 30% fair 10 to 15 years later at much greater scale? In an article by TechCrunch, the App Store intelligence provider AppFigures estimated that in just the US App Store alone, developers grossed about $34 billion, of which Apple took $10 billion. At a global level, that's Apple taking $27 billion out of about $91 billion grossed. Is that just fair play to Apple for having held on to the reins of 30% for so long? Or is that fee at that scale no longer as defensible? What is defensible? 20%? 10%? If you ask Tim Sweeney, CEO of Epic Games, which publishes Fortnite and runs the Epic Games platform, he would say that maybe 8% might be enough to run the storefront profitably and cover all the costs, in the example of a games platform like Steam. And Epic itself charges 12%. Tim Sweeney kind of seemed to take this 30% fee personally, and he made it his mission to constantly push back against Apple and Google's fees, both in the press and in how Epic positioned Fortnite. When Fortnite released on mobile, Epic tried to get around the platform fee. On Android, they encouraged their audience to sideload the app to avoid going through Google's Play Store. But using a non-standard app install flow added a lot of friction for people who were just used to going straight to the Play Store. So eventually, they had to relent and begrudgingly release it on the iOS App Store and Google Play Store. But there were still other cards to play. If someone makes a purchase in-app using Apple and Google's native in-app purchase system, the platform is able to take their share. But many apps were circumventing this by allowing direct payment options, for example by linking to a web browser view where you could enter your credit card information manually. And that's what Epic did in August of 2020 in a planned effort called Project Liberty to bring lawsuits against Apple and Google for not allowing alternative payment options. They did this by putting the alternative payment behind a feature flag, which means they could turn it off when Apple and Google were reviewing the app, but once the app update was approved, Epic could just flip a switch and remotely enable it for everyone, thereby bypassing the normal app review process. This gave users the option to purchase V-Bucks directly from Epic at a 20% discount. And Epic knew this would force a response from the platforms. And indeed, Fortnite was immediately taken down from both platforms for violating terms of service. Then, as already planned, Epic filed antitrust lawsuits against both companies while campaigning to sway public opinion against Apple by highlighting the alleged monopolistic behavior. From 2020 through 2021, the lawsuit went on. And if you worked in the mobile gaming industry during this time, as I did, we all kept an eye on the case. But to be honest, most people didn't think anything would come of it. Because who can even afford the price tag and operational burden of taking on Apple and Google in court, much less winning? Many have tried and failed, and I thought Epic would be no different. During this time, though, in an enemy of my enemy is my friend type of way, companies like Facebook and Microsoft, both seeing Apple as their competition, lended some support to Epic, as did large consumer app companies like Spotify and the Match Group. However, the initial ruling favored Apple on 9 of 10 counts. The 30% fee stood the test of court, as we all kind of expected. The only count on which Apple lost was related to anti-steering. This referred to how Apple prevented apps from directing or even just informing users to alternate payment methods outside the app. So for example, if you wanted to put a link in your app to your website where the user could pay or have a notice in your app mentioning that there were other options period, that was previously not allowed. This is why you would see apps like Spotify, Netflix, or Kindle where there was simply no option to subscribe or make a purchase. From a consumer's perspective, it was a clunky experience, because why can't I buy books on the Kindle app or start a Spotify subscription in the Spotify app? Well, that was born out of companies being not willing to give up 30% of the revenue and instead forcing the user to make the purchase directly on their websites, all the while trying to message to you that, hey, it's Apple forcing our hand on this, not us. So with the new ruling, Apple can no longer prevent developers from linking or notifying users of other storefronts. And you would think that this provides a meet halfway type solution that could make both sides happy. Apple still gets to collect the 30% of purchases made with the iOS payment system. Developers could link to other payment options to bypass the fee. But what Apple did was then levy a 27% fee on off-platform directed sales. That basically defeated the whole purpose of why a developer would do this in the first place, which is to get around the fee. And not only that, Apple would serve warning pop-ups stating that it is not responsible for the privacy or security of purchases made on the web. And this was done obviously to intimidate users into second-guessing leaving the app, and instead sticking to the native Apple in-app purchase. So Epic appealed to the court in 2024 to enforce the anti-steering statute, alleging that Apple was maliciously complying. And then in April 2005, a landmark ruling dropped where the court found that Apple indeed had failed to comply with the anti-steering order. It stated that Apple is prevented from collecting any fees from third-party storefronts, nor impose restrictions on app interfaces, or block such external links outside of a neutral message informing the user they are accessing a third-party site. With this ruling, the floodgates are starting to open. It doesn't mean that the 30% fee is dead, but it means developers can now start testing alternate payment flows and laying groundwork for new monetization models. We're already seeing apps directing you to their websites to pay. Spotify, for example, immediately rolled this out within a day of the new ruling. Fortnite is also now releasing back on the iOS App Store, and at the time of recording this video, the app is actively in Apple review. Personally, I'm cautiously optimistic because I think it's going to take time for developers and mobile app infrastructure providers to figure out what the opportunity exactly is. Because it's not that all of a sudden every app can simply direct every purchase to the web and completely eliminate the fee. Remember, Apple does provide a valuable service by handling the logistics, including SKU management, subscription and IAP management, refund handling, internationalization, and more. And most importantly, people are used to it. We all know and trust making purchases with our Apple IDs. Surely making people enter their credit card info or go through extra steps elsewhere could lead to worse purchase conversion rates. So some developers might be better off still using Apple's system. It also raises questions like, if the App Store cut goes down, should these savings be passed to the consumer? If I was previously paying $10 for a subscription in-app and now I pay through the developer's website, should I expect to pay maybe $7 or $8? Or am I still being charged the full $10 and the developer just has better margins now? And if the developer does have better margins, what do they do with it? Does it get reinvested in more marketing or product development? And how does that affect the ecosystem? All this is to say that there are lots of possibilities. One area to keep an eye on is what mobile app infrastructure providers build in response to this. For example, we're seeing billing management companies like RevenueCat start to build out-of-the-box web payment tools for apps to test with. App Store intelligence and attribution providers like Sensor Tower and AppsWire could start to roll out analytics and solutions for web payments. Marketing, product, and finance team across every big mobile app company are modeling out what their margins could look like if they were to offer web payments that didn't have a 30% fee, and perhaps building web onboarding flows if they didn't have them already. It's also important to call out that the largest developers like Spotify, Epic, or Roblox play a very different game than small to medium-sized developers when it comes to how they manage their relationship with the app stores. The big players can afford to publicly antagonize Apple and Google, but smaller apps that rely on the good graces of them for App Store promotion and account support have much more to lose. These smaller guys have no leverage to negotiate, and the historical, unspoken truth is that they simply keep their mouths shut and do whatever the platforms tell them to do, otherwise risk getting either rejected or losing out on opportunities like getting their app featured. And that's what makes this latest ruling so significant. It's not just about Epic getting a win. It's about changing the long-standing rules of engagement that have governed the mobile ecosystem. For the first time, Apple's control of in-app payments has been meaningfully weakened by the courts, and developers finally have a wedge to push for alternatives. This is still only one domino to fall, and we need to see what actually changes as a result. Maybe this leads to lower prices for consumers and better margins for developers. Maybe this weakens the mobile app duopoly. Or maybe it's too little too late because mobile as a platform could be on its way out in favor of some new AI platform with new rules. But at least a couple of things are clear. Fortnite is just about back on the App Store, and the App Store status quo is no longer a given.